Number 20. Juan. Unlike the ancient Olympic Games on which they are based, the modern Olympics include professionals as well as amateur athletes. But since amateurs rarely have the financial or material resources available to professionals, it is unlikely that the amateurs will ever offer a serious challenge to professionals in those Olympic events in which amateurs compete against professionals. So, hence, the presence of professional athletes' spirits violates the spirit of fairness essential to the games. So Juan is saying, hey, the modern Olympics are unfair, right? He's saying the spirit of fairness is violated, and he's saying that's essential to the games. The reason why is because amateurs and professionals are playing against each other when amateurs don't really have the same financial or material resources available to the professionals, and so they don't really have a level playing field, right? They're at a disadvantage, but they're playing together, and so he's saying this is kind of unfair. Michiko is responding by saying, but the idea of the modern Olympics is to showcase the world's finest athletes. So the purpose of the Olympics for Michiko is to just showcase the world's athletes, finest athletes, regardless of their backgrounds or resources. Hence, professionals should be allowed to compete. So Michiko is saying we should have professionals compete because they're the world's finest athletes, and that's the purpose of the Olympics. So the question is saying, which one of the following, if true, most seriously undermines Juan's argument? So we are trying to undermine Juan's argument, which is that the presence of professional athletes violates the spirit of fairness in the games. So let's see. A, in general, amateur athletes tend to outnumber professional athletes in the modern Olympics. Well, if amateur athletes outnumber professional athletes, you could stretch that to say, hey, maybe that means that they're more likely to win because they have, there's more of them than the professional athletes. So even if they do worse because they have less resources, maybe one of them will win over the professional athletes just because there's more amateurs. That doesn't really do a good job of undermining Juan's argument, and we really, really had to stretch it to get there, right? So A is really, really weak as an answer, so I'm going to leave it open, but I don't really like it. B, in certain events in the modern Olympics, the best few competitors are amateurs. In certain other events, the best few competitors are professionals. Okay, that seems like a pretty good answer. The only reason I'm feeling a little bit hesitant about it is because Juan is specifically talking about events where they are competing against one another, right? And he's saying that it's unfair because they have different resources available to them. So maybe even more of them would win, right, if they had equal resources. So maybe it's still unfair, even though some amateurs are winning a few competitions. And maybe the competitions in which the amateurs are winning only have amateurs in them, right? So I'm feeling a little bit hesitant about B, but I definitely like B better than A. So I'm probably going to cross out A and leave B open. C, the concept of amateur and professional athletics would have been unfamiliar to the ancient Greeks on whose games the modern Olympics are based. So C is just saying, hey, these terms that we're using, the ancient Greeks wouldn't have really used them. Well, how does that matter? How does it matter what the ancient Greeks would have categorized the different players as, or how the Greeks would have categorized the players? That doesn't really do anything to Juan's argument. Juan does say, these current games are based on the ancient Olympic Games, but they're different in that we allow amateurs to participate alongside professionals, I guess. But how the ancient Greeks would have categorized their athletes doesn't really matter to Juan's argument, right? To the core of Juan's argument, which is that the spirit of fairness has been violated in the games because certain players have more resources than others. So C is not really relevant here. In the modern Olympics, there has been no noticeable correlation between the financial or material resources expended on the training of the individual athletes and the eventual performance of those athletes. So D is saying, hey, there's no connection, basically, right? Correlation saying like a pattern between how much money someone has and how many resources someone has as they train and how they end up performing. So then maybe that would suggest that maybe the amateurs aren't at a disadvantage, right? If how well you do is not correlated with how many resources or how much money you had while you trained, then does it matter whether you were an amateur or a professional if really the main difference is that, or the main reason why, Juan thinks it's unfair is because, one group had resources and money and the other group didn't? Well, D is saying, hey, there's no relationship between those resources that, one group had and their eventual performance, right? Like whether they won or lost. So D does a really good job of weakening or undermining Juan's argument, right? Because Juan's whole thing was that, because of this difference in resources available, one group does better than the other. Well, if your performance is not impacted by or correlated with your resources, then it doesn't matter, right? That one group has more resources and that one group has less. So D would do a really, really good job of undermining Juan's argument, and I like D better than B because I had some concerns with B, but I don't really see any similar concerns with D. E, many amateur athletes who take part in international competitions receive no financial or material support from the governments of the countries that the amateurs represent. Well, let's see. So that doesn't really undermine Juan's argument, right? That just kind of fits right into it. If amateur athletes didn't receive financial or material support, well, that just fits right in, right? Maybe they have less money, maybe it's unfair. That doesn't really tell us in any way how we can undermine Juan's argument, right? So E is probably not our answer either. So I would pick D. D is our answer here.